Dear distinguished scholars, dear ladies and gentlemen, I'm very pleased to extend greetings to all of the participants of this international conference, and particularly of this online discussion panel of the interdisciplinary conference, Challenges of Source Evaluation in Science and Correlated Areas. So we are about to start the online panel discussion, which is dedicated to the usage of online free encyclopedias such as Wikipedia and the manipulation of data in academia in general. My name is Kanykei, and I'm very honored to be your moderator on this panel. Let me please present our speakers in the order they are given the floor on this panel. Dr. Massimo Introvigne, professor, sociologist of religion and intellectual property attorney, a founder and the managing director of the Center for Studies on New Religions, CESNUR. He was the representative on combating racism, xenophobia, and discrimination at the OSCE. Dr. Geoffrey Brian West, theoretical physicist, former president and distinguished professor of the Santa Fe Institute. He is the author of several books, among which is Scale, The Universal Laws of Growth, Innovation, Sustainability, and the Pace of Life in Organisms, Cities, Economies, and Companies. He is a visiting professor of mathematics at the Imperial College, London, and an associate fellow of the Sayt Business School at Oxford University. We're happy to greet him. Dr. Oleg Maltsev, author, criminologist, psychologist, photographer, and investigative journalist. He is an academician of the Ukrainian Academy of Sciences, founder and director of the Memory Institute and Expeditionary Corps that regularly conducts field researches around the world and has a unique library of thousands of film photographs and old treatises and manuscripts. Dr. Maltsev is an author of numerous books in the areas such as applied history, sociology, depth psychology, philosophy, criminalistics, and criminology. He is an editor of several interdisciplinary peer-reviewed journals. Welcome, Dr. Oleg Maltsev. Dr. James Finckenauer, organized crime expert, author, distinguished professor emeritus at Rutgers University, former director of the National Institute of Justice, Washington, D.C. Dr. Finckenauer is an expert in human trafficking, juvenile, and international criminal justice. He is an author of numerous books on Russian organized crime in the U.S. You are very welcome to and very happy to see you, Dr. Finckenauer. Dr. Athina Karatzogianni, Associate Professor in Media and Communications at the University of Leicester, United Kingdom. She has an extensive record of publications and citations in disciplinary, field-specific, and cross-disciplinary research outlets, and has demonstrated sustained success in securing research income from research councils of UK and the European Commission. Her most recent book is Platform Economics, Rhetoric and Reality, the Sharing Economy. Happy to see you, Dr. Athina. Lutsyuk Anatoliy, scientist, Department of Fine Organic Synthesis at Bogatsky's Physico-Chemical Institute of National Academy of Sciences of Ukraine. Mr. Lutsyuk is a member of Wikimedia Ukraine and administrator of Ukrainian Wikipedia. So at the beginning of this meeting, please allow me to tell you briefly about the format of the online panel. As usually, we kindly ask every expert to limit his answer up to 8 to 10 minutes. As for the breaks, we're not going to have officially any breaks. However, if you need to use the washroom, if you need to grab a glass of water, please feel free to do so. Just make sure that your microphone is off. So every speaker is going to be given the allocated time for the first question and for the second question as well. So currently, we are starting with the first question of today's online panel, and it is it permissible for a scientist to use free encyclopedias as sources of scientific information, and the role of Wikipedia and similar sources. And the floor is given to Dr. Massimo Introvigne.
Thank you. First of all, I should excuse myself. I will only be part of the first question. Unfortunately, during the pandemic and the quarantine, it seems there are more conferences than before because it's easier to organize conferences online. So I should, after my comments, jump to another online webinar. I believe this is, of course, interesting in itself because when the COVID ends, we can ask ourselves what we will do with all this material and all these webinars and web conferences. Who will be able to really store and use this enormous amount of materials and how authoritative as a source these webinars. Only my field, the sociology of religion, I'm trying to keep track of them. There have been hundreds. And what will be the epistemological status of this source? So I believe we are making the history of sources at the same time while we are discussing it. Concerning Wikipedia, Wikipedia is very uneven. It's a good first stop to find some information which are generally reliable, such as the dates of birth and death of people, some bibliography, even if there are a lot of mistakes even there. But when you should reconstruct the opinions of somebody, the more complicated these opinions, the less reliable Wikipedia becomes. Even if in some languages, I would say German, which has some sort of a special system to double check it, it's better than in English. I will also say when I interact with students of religion, on Wikipedia, I believe there is a practical rule. The more controversial the subject, the less Wikipedia should be trusted as a source because it becomes a battlefield. And I believe we are having this conference in a very interesting day, because if you look around in these very days, there are several articles about how battles are fought in the English Wikipedia in entries devoted to Biden or to Trump or to the elections in the United States or to the main co-workers of Biden and Trump. And of course, it's totally political battlefield. But in my field, if you look, for example, on entries connected with Church of Scientology, they are battlefields too. I would say with a notable prevalence of those who don't like the Church of Scientology, for the good reason that Scientology is perceived as a group which is trying through court case to limit the activity of its critics into the internet. So it's probably understandable that the average administrator of Wikipedia doesn't like Scientology. But from my point of view, as somebody who has studied Scientology for 30 years, that results in a number of mistakes and even blatant falsehoods being perpetuated in the Wikipedia about Scientology. For example, texts that scholars have long proved to be apocryphal. They were never written by the founder of Scientology, are still considered as genuine in Wikipedia and quoted to illustrate the alleged opinions of the founder of Scientology. And that Scientology is only one example, of course, in a number of controversial subjects in the sociology and history of religions. The opinions it's very easy to manipulate Wikipedia. And my final comment is this manipulation also becomes political, because when we discuss groups which are the subject of state repression in countries like China or Russia, it has been alleged that the governments of these countries or agencies connected with the governments can also try to manipulate Wikipedia. And certainly I found evidence or at least clues of this with regard to how the Chinese government tries to act on Wikipedia, both in Chinese and in English, which is paradoxical because Wikipedia is banned in China. You cannot access it from China, but nonetheless, they employ many trolls to intervene in Wikipedia as they intervene in Facebook, which is also banned in China, or in Twitter, which is also banned in China. So I'm not a universal specialist. I always try to confine my judgments to the narrow field I am expert of, which is the sociology of religions. And I would say, and it's not my personal opinion, I believe in my field, it's a widely shared opinion by scholars, and it's in the part of the courses they give to students, is Wikipedia is a good tool for some very basic information. But when it comes to controversial subjects or to attributing opinions or theories, particularly to controversial religious groups, not to mention those who study them, it should always be double checked and triple checked with other sources. In our field, sociology of religion, as in many other fields I'm aware of, scholars have tried to create their own encyclopedic websites. For instance, the Virginia Commonwealth University in Richmond, Virginia, has created a huge website of entries about religion called the War, Religions and Spirituality Project. And of course, some people who operate on Wikipedia don't like it, so they try to cancel references to this huge academic website when they are at odds with certain opinion prevailing in Wikipedia, again, particularly about controversial subjects. But I would say that in the field of religion, I would advise the students, and most of my colleagues advise students to rely on such specialized online encyclopedias operated by the academic community rather than relying on Wikipedia. Having said so, I'm grateful to Wikipedia because I always find there the occasional years of birth and death or the surface of the number of inhabitants of some countries. But in my specialized field, it's not a very useful tool, and sometimes may be highly confusing. So thank you. I will follow perhaps the next one or two panelists, and then, as I said, I should jump elsewhere. So don't hold it against me. I don't mean to be impolite, but these are difficult times.
Thanks, dear Professor. Discussion will be continued by Professor Finckenauer. Please unmute yourself. No, you unmute it and then mute it again.
Okay. Can you hear me now? Okay. This is an interesting question about Wikipedia. I myself sometimes use Wikipedia if I want to look up something very quickly and I want a simple answer to a straightforward question and I want it very quickly. But I have to tell you that my sense prior to thinking more about it for this purpose was that Wikipedia is good for that purpose, but not good if one wants to do serious research and really depend upon reliable and valid sources of information. So I decided, well, that's my preliminary conclusion. Maybe I should do some research and see whether that conclusion is in fact supported. And let me briefly report to you some of the things I found in this research, which I think are quite interesting. This happens to be the 20th year of the founding of Wikipedia. So there are a number of things that have been published about Wikipedia, looking at the impact of the last 20 years and how it's evolved and changed and so on. And from one of these pieces on this 20th anniversary of Wikipedia, the consensus conclusion is that Wikipedia is the major success story of the internet era. The major success story of the internet era, which is a very glowing, obviously, conclusion and large conclusion. Why is that? Wikipedia has more than 55 million articles in 313 languages. This is today. 55 million articles. This is compared to the Encyclopedia Britannica, which is generally regarded as the sort of scientific gold standard for the publication of research, has, on the other hand, 65,000 articles in its print edition. Look at those two numbers, 65,000 Encyclopedia Britannica, 55 million for Wikipedia in 313 languages. I suspect, I don't know this for a fact, but I suspect that Encyclopedia Britannica doesn't come close to being printed in 300 and some languages. So you have an enormous gap, a comparative gap between the two publications. In looking at this, by the way, Wikipedia is the second most visited site on the web in the United States, second only to YouTube. Wikipedia gets over 1 billion visits a month. 1 billion visits a month to Wikipedia. So the impact is just enormous. How good is the information on Wikipedia? Well, they also describe this. In an article that was published in the Nature magazine, academic scientists compared 42 science articles that were published in Wikipedia and the same in Encyclopedia Britannica. It was determined that the Wikipedia articles averaged 4 errors per article. The Encyclopedia Britannica articles averaged 3 errors per article. So the comparative difference, 4 for Wikipedia, 3 for Encyclopedia Britannica. So there is not this enormous Wikipedia is a bunch of garbage and not factual, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, in the view of these persons who've taken a look at this. So the impact has been enormous. The final conclusion that the people writing about this say, Wikipedia is an aggregator site. It is not a site that publishes original research. It pulls in articles and information from a whole variety of sources, puts them together. The references are there. People can look at this and they can decide for themselves. They can go to the references. They can check things out. If they have questions about different observations that are being made, they can further research those. The final conclusion they have is that it's basically a dumping ground. These are their words, a dumping ground of links, factoids, and data. Links, factoids, and data. But at the same time, they make the observation that knowledge isn't data. It's what you do with the data that produces knowledge. So what should one conclude from all of this? First of all, is Wikipedia worthwhile? Obviously, yes. It's worthwhile in many respects. Should it be the sole source of a scientific research project? Absolutely not. Should it be something that you should take with a grain of salt, as we say? Yes, absolutely. Should one be very careful in checking out the sources and trying to verify for oneself where one is being led by reading various articles? Yes, one should. And the idea is that this is a self-editing piece of material, so that as you, the reader, find out more information about Wikipedia, what you're supposed to do is correct things that you see being wrong. And this kind of self-correcting process is in lieu of the normal peer review process that's used in scientific journals. So, is it a good thing? I think absolutely so. It's a good thing. Has it helped advance science and scientific knowledge? Absolutely so. And in particular, has it opened up to a world of people who don't ever read scientific journals, have no sense of scientific journals, would have no knowledge about anything that's in scientific journals, opens up for them a whole source of information, as long, and again, I'll lay this proviso, as long as people are careful, as long as people judge for themselves, don't take, just on the face of it, these as being factually correct and reliable, but delve into, look at the background, look what the sources are, check out those sources for yourself. But it's an excellent start, and I think addresses a lot of issues for a lot of people that would not otherwise get addressed.
Thank you, Professor Finckenauer, for your speech. Happy to greet you, Geoffrey Brian West. You're now with us. I would like to give the floor to Dr. Oleg Maltsev. Please unmute yourself. We don't hear you.
Добрый день, уважаемые дамы и господа.
Best regards and welcome, dear ladies and gentlemen.
Я попробую ответить на вопрос, поставленный в конференции.
Sure enough, I'm going to take an attempt to provide you with the answer to the question the online conference panel is about.
Но сначала расскажу вам две истории.
But to begin with, I'd love to share with you two stories.
Первая история произошла в Нью-Йорке.
The first story took place in New York.
Когда я писал книгу «Бескомпромиссный маятник».
That was that very moment Dr. Maltsev was creating a book, a non-compromised pendulum.
И там была оживленная дискуссия.
And let's pretend, there was like a round table, many people were sitting, and there was a tough discussion.
И за столом присутствовали два доктора.
And by that very time, there were two PhDs, like two doctors of philosophy, sitting right there and participating in discussion.
Я и Weiss.
Adam Scott Weiss. Yeah, there were two people, like Dr. Maltsev, the doctor of philosophy, and Dr. Adam Scott Weiss.
И вот в один момент времени мы говорили о психологических аспектах и о философских аспектах.
In creation of a non-compromised pendulum, many things were discussed. Likewise, the psychological aspects and philosophical aspects.
И за столом присутствовал один высокопоставленный американский чиновник.
Apart from two doctors, there was also one very authoritative person who is actually, let me say, a governing figure.
И он сказал нам, что философия и психология – это одно и то же.
And to be more sharp, actually, that wasn't just an ordinary person. That was a governor, sure. And he actually made such, he claimed the statement that philosophy equals to psychology. Like this is just the same, one notion.
Мы ему попытались объяснить, что это не так.
Of course, both Dr. Adam Scott Weiss and Dr. Maltsev tried to explain and verify that actually it's not like that. Psychology is psychology, philosophy is philosophy. These are two different things.
Но он решил, значит, подкрепить свои знания неубиенным ресурсом.
However, that very person was very straightforward in his judgments, and he decided to verify his judgments with a special resource.
И, в общем-то, достал телефон и начал вводить в Википедии психология и философия.
And then he took his cell phone and he started searching on Wikipedia the two entries, like psychology and philosophy.
И оказалось, что это две разные науки.
And having read these both entries, he realized, like, well, yeah, you know, these are two different disciplines.
Да, то есть он убедился, что это две разные науки только когда открыл Википедию.
So actually, this is the story explaining that very person was persuaded that psychology and philosophy are two different scientific disciplines only having read these entries on Wikipedia.
То есть, когда два профессора ему говорят, что это не так, он в это не верит.
Again, please be attentive to the situation. Two professors, two doctors were trying to explain, like, you know, psychology is not philosophy. These are different things. He still didn't believe two professors.
Но вот, когда он увидел в Википедии, что это две разные как бы вещи, он тогда смирился.
However, again, having read in Wikipedia that psychology actually is not like philosophy, and then he said, yeah, let it be like that.
Да, мы оказались как бы правы.
And Wikipedia told him, sorry for being straightforward, but again, Wikipedia explained him that professors are right in their judgments.
Да. Эта история нас учит одному, мы чуть позже к этому вернемся.
Of course, this story may provide us with a lesson. We're going to speak about it later on.
А вторая история произошла в Калабрии.
And the second story I'd love to speak about actually took place in Calabria.
Я сидел в ресторане с одним профессором Калабрийского университета.
Dr. Maltsev was in the restaurant together with his friend, he's professor of one of Calabrian universities.
Который там всю свою жизнь занимается определенной проблематикой Калабрии.
And that very friend of Dr. Maltsev actually for his thorough life is involved in studies of history of Calabria. Actually, he's studying research in Calabrian region.
И по сути своей, каждый раз, когда я ему задавал простой вопрос по его предмету,
And the idea of the story is as follows. Every time Dr. Maltsev asked that professor about certain Calabrian issues that actually that professor should know, because for his thorough life, he was researching these things.
Он брал телефон и тут же набирал это в Википедии, чтобы мне ответить.
The reaction of the professor wasn't like, oh, this is my answer. No, he was taking his phone, he was asking Wikipedia and only providing with an answer afterwards.
У меня есть целая видеозапись двухчасовая этого.
And we've got a video that helps everyone to see the way that discussion took place.
И так делают 80% профессоров Европы.
Again, this is professor who is asking Wikipedia what's going on concerning a certain subject. And this is not just an exclusion, it's not one professor. 80% of professors do the same.
То есть тех, кого я знаю лично, 80% делают именно так.
Of course, Dr. Maltsev was speaking about scholars he is acquainted with personally. But again, amidst these people, 80% are still, the very first step of them is take phone, grab phone, and ask Wikipedia. That's what they do, the majority of people.
И только 20% вот этих ученых владеют предметом, который они занимаются, без Википедии.
And only 20% of professors left actually are the people who do not require Wikipedia because actually they are professionals in their field and they don't need that issue.
Да, то есть это не бог весть какая выборка, то есть, потому что это мои личные знакомства, да, но уже просто одно это говорит об огромном влиянии этого ресурса даже на академическую науку.
So Dr. Maltsev explains that, of course, this selection is not like a totally huge one, but still, this is the story that explains that even professors, even high-ranked experts still use Wikipedia.
Говорят, что я неплохой психолог.
There is a saying that Dr. Maltsev is a pretty good psychologist.
И я когда-то посмотрел на Википедию глазами ученого-психолога.
And once Dr. Maltsev was, it's like an experiment. It was like an experiment, right? So Dr. Maltsev tried to have a look on Wikipedia as a psychologist.
И я понял, что это отличный психологический инструмент.
And having taken this experiment, he realized that Wikipedia is the great psychological tool.
И вероятнее всего, чтобы вразумить американских чиновников, этот инструмент психологически очень неплохой.
And well, we could pretend or like suspect that maybe in case we need to explain something to American representatives of state authorities, like something is correct or not correct, maybe for that sake Wikipedia is a good source.
Да, но для серьезного человека Википедия никакой информации полезной для него содержать не может.
However, for a more serious person, for let me say, for a professional, Wikipedia is not the resource concerning the 100% correct or serious information.
То есть человек, у которого интеллект чуть выше как бы американского чиновника.
Right now, by serious people, I mean people whose IQ actually prevails the IQ of ordinary American person of government.
Да, для этого человека Википедия не может быть никаким источником информации, не только научным. Я сейчас объясню почему.
Actually, for a person whose IQ is, let me say, higher than an average one, Wikipedia cannot be the source. Again, it's not permissible to call Wikipedia the source of scientific information. As well, it is not permissible to claim this is the source of information at all.
То есть любой ученый, который посмотрел бы на свои статьи в Википедии, он бы увидел, что они полностью не соответствуют действительности.
Any expert, any scholar who takes a look and reads Wikipedia entries, he realizes that the contents of these entries have nothing to do with the reality because they contradict to the actual state of things.
И сколько я ученых не спрашивал, не проводил эксперименты, возьмите статьи, касающиеся ваших изысканий научных, то есть вашей плоскости. Все ученые говорят, что все статьи страшным образом искажены.
Moreover, right now we are speaking not only about certain or specific scientific fields, we're speaking about any scientific field. In case you would like to verify this explanation, please ask any professor, ask any expert to have a look at certain entries. And these professors, actually, they would say, you know, this is a distortion. This is not the things that have something to do with reality. We deal with a certain distortion of information.
И возникает вопрос, а почему так?
So why is it so?
Все очень просто. Дело в том, что в Википедии содержится политическая информация, а не научная.
Why is it so? The answer is simple. The reason is based on the fact Wikipedia is all about political aspect of information. however, it's not a scientific. So again, this is political type of information uploading, but not the scientific one.
То есть, если мы соединим эти два случая и то, что я вам сейчас рассказал, то у нас получится следующее.
So again, if we let me say, have in mind the two previous stories and the things that Dr. Maltsev has shared, we can have several conclusions.
Что Википедия – это отличный психологический инструмент донесения политической информации.
So the conclusion number one, Wikipedia is a great psychological tool allowing one to share political information.
Не более того.
And that's it. Nothing else.
То есть, когда вы хотите изучить политическую информацию в той или иной сфере жизнедеятельности мировой, Википедия для вас подходит идеально.
So, right in case someone is excited to know what's been used from the political perspective about certain occurrences or events, then Wikipedia is a great resource for that sake, since it provides the political aspect of information.
Если же вы хотите знать правду, то Википедия вам не подходит.
However, if you're the person who is keen on truth, then Wikipedia is not for you.
Ни ученому, ни студенту, ни обывателю обыкновенному. То есть считать, что то, что написано в Википедии, правда, это обрекать себя на очень серьезную ошибку.
Actually, the main idea is that it doesn't matter who you are, either you're a professor or you're a student, an expert, or just a person who wants to read something. In case you would love to deal with truth, in case you're seeking for the truth, then Wikipedia is not for you, because it has nothing to do with the truth. Everything that's written there has nothing to do with truth.
И если человек, и в том числе ученый, начинает воспринимать Википедию как психологический инструмент донесения политической информации во всех сферах, то у него как бы все становится на свои как бы места.
However, right in case the person realizes that if he's dealing with Wikipedia, he's actually dealing with a psychological tool, allowing certain interested people to release information under the political perspective, then this is the case.
Спасибо за внимание.
Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Maltsev, for your speech. And the discussion will be continued by Professor Geoffrey Brian West.
Mute. Okay. Can you hear me? Yes. Good. So first of all, apologies that I was delayed getting on. I was involved in another event that I had warned Kanykei might go on for a little bit after the beginning of this. But anyway, I'm glad that it's worked out that I could join you. I do need to warn you, my internet has crashed 4 times this morning, so I hope you don't lose me. We had a big storm here, and it caused all kinds of problems. Anyway, so first of all, you know, I do not consider myself having expertise in making pronouncements about Wikipedia and the dissemination of knowledge, whether it's scientific, cultural, political, and so on. On the other hand, of course, like all of us, I'm very familiar with Wikipedia. My credentials, I guess, are that I've been 60 years a researcher in several different fields, physics, biology, social sciences, and so on, and familiar with the different cultures. I try to reach out to the public, and Wikipedia has played in recent years a very important role. And in that sense, I agree. I came only towards the last part of Jim Finckenauer's presentation, and I found myself in agreement with pretty much everything you said. In fact, as I was listening, I thought, I don't know what the point is in me speaking, because I would say pretty much many of the same things. I only partially agree with Dr. Maltsev about Wikipedia, because I think Oleg has focused on the really dark side of Wikipedia, which no doubt exists. On the other hand, so let me first address the light side, the positive. I must say, when it first came online, I was extremely skeptical and very critical. But over the years, I would say that it has proven to be, for first of all, on a personal level, an extremely useful tool, but a tool with lots of caveats, with lots of buyer beware, caveat emptor, that one should take nothing, obviously, that is written in Wikipedia as God-given or truth and so on, but it's a very useful point of departure for following up and checking on what they claim to be facts, or claim to be what the present state of knowledge is about a certain subject, or what the political situation might be. But it's a very useful form. And I want to just go back, because before that, what did we use in? So of course, within a field, one used annual reviews and articles written that to give you a broad overview of a subject. But in the sense that the role Wikipedia plays, it is really a follow-on from the traditional encyclopedia, and which in a educated household, encyclopedias were very common. And one would look up things, and just like one does in Wikipedia, and one get a sense of whatever it was that one was trying to find out about. And one took for granted, in terms of encyclopedias, that they were written by experts, and that there was that one could face value. And indeed, the Encyclopedia Britannica, which was maybe the greatest of all the ones in the English-speaking world, was written truly by experts. I mean, just a side comment, there's a very famous article written in 1904 about electricity and magnetism, written by James Clerk Maxwell, so to speak, you know, the great physicist who founded all electricity and magnetism. So there was coming from the greatest expert, and that was sort of the image of an encyclopedia, that one could trust it, that it was a great source, and you could use it as a point of departure for digging deeper. And Wikipedia is, of course, using that background, that cultural phenomenon of the hard copy encyclopedia to promote what it's trying to do. And I would say, in a large degree, it has been successful, because it does work through a kind of naive faith in a free market system, where things that are wrong will be checked and corrected. Now, I know, obviously, in fields I'm very familiar with, that's worked only to varying degrees. And so certainly, if you are a professional, whatever it is the field, whether you're an academic or a politician, a business, owning a business, running a company, obviously it's a good source, and it's a good source in order to acquaint oneself with things, the kinds of issues and questions that come up in your daily challenges. Now, and it is the onus on each person to really check what is written, and to follow up with sources that are in the literature. Now, there's a problem with that, and because it's easy to say follow up with the literature, but there are two problems. One is the literature is enormous, and many people actually don't have access to the many journals, and many of the journals charge significant amounts of money in order to get access. So it's very easy for me to say, and for any of us to say, yes, you have to check the facts, check what's written, but unless you have a institutional framework for doing that, I think that's a big issue, even in professional situations. It becomes an even bigger issue, of course, for something that Finckenauer mentioned at the end, and I think what Oleg was referring to, and that is its role in the popular culture. Because on the one hand, it's been fantastic that the so to speak, intelligent layperson, the person that's curious about something, now has relatively easy access to finding out about various issues, technical issues and political issues and so on. But it becomes increasingly more difficult for that person to follow up with checking out the facts, because the barrier to doing so is extremely high, not just because of what I said, because you've got to have access to the right sources, and those right sources often cost money. But there's another huge issue, which is the backdrop to all of this, and that is that we're all inundated with huge amounts of data, with huge amounts of news, and most of us simply don't have time. So that is where I'm in agreement with the spirit of what Dr. Maltsev said, is that in that sense, Wikipedia is quite dangerous, even if you have a label on it, you know, check it out, don't trust it, there's an expiration date or whatever, because we do not have, most people do not have either the financial resources, the accessibility, and most importantly, the time and energy to do so. So that's a huge issue. An issue that's related to this, that I'm, as an academic, that I'm actually more concerned with, is the proliferation of journals that are purported to be professional journals, and lie somewhere between the traditional professional journals that have strong reputations and where the refereeing process, the review process is strong. They're somewhere between that and Wikipedia, which suffers from this problem that it's not peer-reviewed, it's done just by a free market system. So we have this proliferation of journals, and that's where I feel there's a huge problem that we're only just beginning to see the tip of the iceberg of, and that is that quoting, so even if you go to Wikipedia and you go to a professional journal, to what sense can you trust the professional journal? And maybe that's the second part of this question today, which maybe we'll come to. But to sum up, I overall, despite all its shortcomings, I think Wikipedia has been an important and powerful addition to the kind of access to knowledge, to resources, and so forth. And it's certainly much better, by the way, than what has happened, at least in the United States, and I assume it's elsewhere, and that is the dominance of social media and the problems that we have with Facebook and Twitter and the like, which are sort of cousins to Wikipedia in that sense, in that the whole question of reviewing, the whole question of trusting and so forth come forth. So I think this is still very much a work in progress. I think we still have to see how this eventually develops. But I do fear, actually, despite my enthusiasm for Wikipedia, I do fear that the kinds of pictures that Dr. Maltsev painted may be much more general and much more of concern than many of us are willing to believe. So with that, I'll finish.
Thank you, dear Professor Geoffrey. And the discussion will be continued by Professor Athina. Please.
Hi, yes, thank you. I remember about 10 years ago, there was a very, very interesting and fascinating conference held at the Amsterdam Library in Amsterdam by a good colleague that I collaborate still to this day, Gert Loving, on Wikipedia actually, and it was called The Critical Point of View. So one of the claims that is very interesting with Wikipedia is this neutral, that it's supposed to have this neutral point of view, this objective kind of things. You have like this editing upon editing and arriving in something that resembles sort of a neutral or objective kind of point of view. And I guess these days, our students at university, but also politicians, famously people in charge of all sorts of important portfolios have said, oh, I went and checked these bushfires on Wikipedia. You know, they might make some decision that is important by going to Wikipedia. So in that sense, it is a place that cannot be dismissed as, okay, so this is not an academic viewpoint, because people do use it. And in fact, recently, my understanding is this September, just a few months ago, some economists experimented by putting pictures about Spain and the cities that were edited. They showed an important increase in tourism. So there is like this, there is an impact in what is on Wikipedia and how people are treated there, the biographies. So what I have had an interest in is this neutral point of view, and how can you have a neutral point of view? So how do you get to that? How do you triangulate this neutral point of view? And I think that speaks to some of the concerns that the other colleagues here have raised. So that's one of the problems I have, is that I don't think that you can, on certain subjects that have been very controversial, and there's like about 400 different articles on the controversies, Wikipedia, like sort of referencing these controversies. So like you need about like a couple of days to understand this list of controversies of the last 20 years and what has happened there, because people, there were controversies, for example, about how the organization is led, with Jimmy Wells controversies, where he famously was editing his own entry, that he, left his girlfriend by making an entry on his biography on the site, for instance, and that there is no, there's forms of corruption in terms of like, there was a sock puppet controversy in 2013 that is very interesting, about people using paying editors for PR purposes, and there has been loads of this type of thing where people are whitewashing, they're using Wikipedia. There's assistants of politicians and members of parliament and so on, like even from the inside the parliament, making edits on Wikipedia to sort of for PR purposes. So there was that scandal has been like a real big one, and also people resigning over such scandals. And I think it is interesting to what extent, because there is an example, as it was mentioned previously, of the business model is a non-profit organization, so it has to do with donations, right? So it's a very different model from how Facebook works, selling ads, targeting, selling us as products and so on. Wikipedia is a non-profit organization, so it's based on donations, but there has been controversy also about how transparently those donations have been, used by the different organizations as well, inside the various branches of Wikipedia. Right. Now, for me, organizationally, it is very interesting as an organization. So the political economy of it, like, or the organization of it, because it has arbitration boards and like this kind of things where you can go and complain and get a solution. It might take 5 years, but there is that kind of possibility. And so I found that very interesting, how this works. Another interesting thing I find about Wikipedia is this sort of the sexism, the allegations for having like sort of this sexist culture, and that related with the Gamergate scandal in 2015. for instance, where you had like sort of a controversy there. I find very interesting the problem of how governments occasionally will attempt to ban Wikipedia as well, like it happened in 2019 during the Venezuela crisis. Where you had like the state kind of organization, state media trying to ban Wikipedia, or how different governments have engaged with Wikipedia as well. And also that there is sort of this idea that it takes a little while to uncover sort of an organized efforts against specific people, organized, for example, there was a scandal with the Russian kind of state and sort of trolling and like specific things against specific individuals as well. But I think this is something that that shows that Wikipedia in a way is another terrain where you have like these conflicts like being reproduced in a certain way, and how they transparently and accountably are resolved is an interesting story as well. So for me, I think that as other people have mentioned, for a quick review. So for example, in my research, if I want to look at what kind of protest happened in 2019 or whatever, something like that, I could go there and I can get a quick overview, but you cannot rely on the information because often it's not exactly triangulated. So I cannot accept it as a factual story, right? And this is because I don't very easily accept that. Maybe I have trust issues and so on. But for me, writing on a given subject, knowledge production in itself presupposes that you have an ideology written into that discourse. That discourse has ideology in it. It's an ideological production. Now, the fact that Wikipedia might be in a way breaking down like some more hierarchical forms of knowledge production because also of how their licensing works, people can use it, share alike and so on. I think that is an important factor, and also that it's a non-profit. So it is it is not a corporate thing. It doesn't have ads. There was also a controversy about ads or about adding a search engine at some point in its past, the Wikipedia's past. But I think, generally speaking, I have trouble kind of looking at a student's essay that basically is based on Wikipedia will never get, like I don't think that would never get a good mark, in the sense that, and also sometimes I find that when I want to say that something is like generalist and doesn't have a viewpoint, it doesn't innovate, and it's too general, I will say, well, what is this? Is this a Wikipedia article? And in the sense, like, it just gives us like a general overview, pretended to be neutral, whatever. So in that sense, I appreciate it for many reasons, Wikipedia, but for me, the most interesting thing about Wikipedia is the controversies, the organization, the culture, the organizational culture it has, the model that they're propagating, and how radical it is, this model, in comparison to other like corporate models. So this is where I would intervene with that one. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. And now the discussion will be continued by Lutsyuk Anatoliy, who is the administrator of Ukrainian Wikipedia. So it's great to hear somebody who is inside of this thing. Please, Mr. Lutsyuk. Unmute yourself. Мы вас не слышим. Там внизу микрофончик.
Да, добрый вечер, коллеги. Все хорошо слышно, да, меня? Значит, что я хочу сказать, в продолжение темы. Википедия стала, было много проектов, таких как подобных онлайн-энциклопедий, но от них мало что, ничего не осталось. Почему Википедия стала одной из таких, из ведущих?
First of all, let me greet everybody here on this second panel. And talking about Wikipedia, I can say that there were a lot of such encyclopedias.
I have to interrupt. Could you please mute yourself? I think you have problems with the technology. So while our translator Marina Saparkina is dealing with her technology, I'll do the translating. So Mr. Lutsyuk is trying to speak about the importance of Wikipedia, telling that there are so many different free encyclopedias and a lot of projects that are going on. However, they are not as demanded as Wikipedia.
И тут, пожалуй, причина в том, почему Википедия осталась. Об этом уже говорил профессор Интровини, что были базовые правила. Это авторитетные источники, нет оригинальным, no original research, и прочее. То есть у нас в Википедии была твердая основа, которая вот уже 20 лет ей позволяет существовать и конкурировать даже с такими энциклопедиями, как Британика.
So Mr. Lutsyuk is explaining why Wikipedia why does it still exist despite so many different projects that have been brought up as a rival to it. And Mr. Lutsyuk is saying that Professor Introvigne partially covered those aspects. So to single out those reasons is that Wikipedia has certain basic rules. They have a requirement for sources that could be used in the Wikipedia article. And he says that this foundation has allowed Wikipedia to be competitive in the course of many years and to be even a good competitor to Britannica.
И поэтому, допустим, если, как профессор Мальцев говорил, что для общественных наук, возможно, Википедия не дает правду. Но вот я как химик могу привести пример. Мой коллега, который сейчас преподает в университете МcGill в Монреале, он, когда начал читать лекции, он их читал по Википедии. То есть, в принципе, Википедия вполне достаточно для того, чтобы обучать студентов.
And here, Mr. Lutsyuk says that Professor Maltsev has noted that if we are speaking about academic areas, if we are speaking about real research, it's not enough to use Wikipedia. It's not a reliable source. And Mr. Lutsyuk is giving an example. His colleague at the University of Montreal surprisingly did lecture his students based on Wikipedia.
Также, допустим, если проводили исследования, вот как был пример Nature, статьи, которые сравнивали Британику и Википедию, сравнивали украинскую юридическую энциклопедию и статьи на юридическую тематику в Википедии. И оказалось, что статьи в Википедии намного более точны, чем статьи в юридической энциклопедии. Но здесь причина достаточно проста, что Википедия очень быстро обновляется. То есть та энциклопедия издавалась более 10 лет назад, и информация в ней устарела. А информация, юридическая информация в Википедии достаточно актуальна.
And Mr. Lutsyuk is giving an example of one study which was conducted by comparing legal encyclopedia and Wikipedia when it comes to legal issues. And it turned out that Wikipedia was more accurate and was more up-to-date than the legal encyclopedia. For the reason, as Mr. Lutsyuk believes, is because Wikipedia is updated regularly, and the legal encyclopedia was not updated for many years.
И вот это такая точность, которая дает, важно, что Википедия дает базовые знания. И вот это вот, как бы ее все знают о том, что у нее дают базовые знания, и в результате, например, если мы возьмем реестр судебных решений Украины и посмотрим, введем слово Википедия, мы найдем, сейчас скажу точно, 486 решений. 486 документов, в которых, судебных решений, в которых использовались формулировки из Википедии. То есть это тоже такой важный факт признания.
Then Mr. Lutsyuk is noting that Wikipedia provides the basic, very basic knowledge, and people know that. To highlight its accuracy in specific fields, he's giving an example which is related to the Ukraine particularly. He says if you go to the website of a registry of court decisions of Ukraine, and if you type the word Wikipedia, you can find 486 documents that have used certain definitions or certain excerpts from Wikipedia articles.
И вот я, как один из редакторов Википедии, скажем, сообщества, я немного работал в украинской и в русской Википедиях. Есть одна из больших проблем, это проблема авторитетности источников. И сообщество Википедии делает анализ этих источников. Вот важно, насколько, чтобы была селекция источников для написания статей. Это очень важный момент, который мы стараемся следить.
So, as a person who has an experience of working in Russian Wikipedia and Ukraine Wikipedia as well, Mr. Lutsyuk wants to point out that one of the main issues that they are confronting is the credibility of sources, choosing right sources to write articles in the Wikipedia.
И поэтому, скажем, статьи на политические темы получаются чаще всего намного хуже, потому что очень сложно классифицировать источники, сложно отделить авторитетное, надежное от ненадежного.
So it is quite hard to make articles on political topics because it's extremely hard to classify actually sources as which ones are credible and which ones are not. So I think my colleague Marina Saparkina is back here, so please, she will continue this.
И поэтому, например, если взять статьи в украинской Википедии, да и в русской, и в английской, на политические темы, они часто действительно являются самыми такими самыми противоречивыми. Например, в украинской Википедии самые противоречивые статьи – это статьи о Порошенко и Зеленском, двух последних президентах. О них много спорят, и ни одна из них не приведена к нейтральной точке зрения.
And for example, when we make a look on the different articles in Ukrainian Wikipedia, and also when we speak about English Wikipedia and Russian Wikipedia, we see that the most contradictory articles is politician articles, actually. And when we talk about Ukrainian Wikipedia, we see that the most contradictory articles, it's about Zelensky and Poroshenko, our presidents.
Еще могу привести пример, допустим, как важно, почему источники должны быть наиболее авторитетные, наиболее, допустим, если мы пишем о науке, то желательно тоже, чтобы источник была научная статья. Например, в статье о Голодоморе была 10 лет была ссылка о том, что в городах население от голода умерло больше, чем в селах. И эту информацию использовал в своих потом публикациях профессор Касьянов, который взял с Википедии. А это оказалась ошибка.
And also we have to understand that we need authoritative sources even for Wikipedia. For example, we had such a situation in Ukrainian Wikipedia when people were talking about famine, when people were very hungry, and it was a time when people died because they were hungry. And there was a link which said that actually people in cities dead a lot of more people dead because of the hungry than in villages. And this is not true. But some of the scientists, Mr. Kasyanov, he actually took this information from the Wikipedia, but it was a mistake.
И эта ошибка была взята с одной пресс-конференции, которую давали действительно ученые, но журналисты где-то что-то неправильно пересказали. То есть, а потом википедисты взяли уже статью, не научную статью, а именно статью, данные тоже как бы слова ученых, но сказанные не в научной статье, а в публицистической. И вот такого рода верификация информации очень важна, потому что очень просто допустить ошибку.
And actually, this information was taken from the press conference where scientists said something like this, but not exactly like this. But when journalists took this information, they make some mistake in the articles. And after, Wikipedia took the information from the articles of journalists, but not from the scientists. And this is very important problem because we need some kind of verification, not from the journalists, but from the scientists.
Ну, спасибо за внимание. Я свой лимит исчерпал.
Thank you very much for your attention. I have said everything that I wanted to say about the first question.
Thank you, Anatoliy, Lutsyuk. And we are coming to our next question of the panel, and it is the following. The manipulation of data in science, in academia in general as well, challenges of assessing results received through quantitative and qualitative methods, the problem of division and disciplinary biases in modern science. Please, Professor Geoffrey West, would you mind please commenting on this topic?
Oh my goodness. Okay. Well, you know, I'm in the fields I'm in, I would say primarily there isn't a lot of what you would characterize as manipulation of data. The bigger question is access to data, and then, of course, credibility of that data. For example, we can go from one extreme, which is, for example, I've worked for many years in high energy physics and now taking data from big accelerators and, for example, CERN in Switzerland, in Geneva. And we have the problem there that there's only one experiment, that's it. And so you don't have the possibility that you do in traditional science of repetition. That's a crucial aspect in terms of confirming theories and predictions and so on for the progress of science. So there's an enormous trust dimension that whatever this group of, you know, could be 2,000 or 3,000 experimentalists together have decided this is what we've measured, this is the truth, you have to trust us. And they have indeed manipulated the data because there's all kinds of corrections to be made, all kinds of manipulations in order to get it into a form that can be used for other researchers. And so one has to trust that. And that comes, of course, from reputation and you know, a build-up of reputation over many years. So that's one pole of the problem. The other extreme is I have worked quite a bit in companies and social organizations and so forth. And there, the problem is of a very different nature. It's that the proprietorship of data, that is, the data may exist, but you can't get it. Or in order to get it, in some cases, you have to pay very large amounts of money. And that data, again, has been massaged, it's been manipulated, even if you pay that money. And that's data on, which basically comes from tax returns of companies. So you have to go through the Internal Revenue Service of the United States, and then you have to go through whoever compiles that data, puts it into a form that can be used. So there's, again, a huge trust involved, and that's an enormous problem. But even more difficulty is if you want to understand an organization, then you need to understand what goes on inside that organization. And then you have the problem of what is the internal data to a specific company or to a group of companies. And that is a huge issue, because if you ask organizations, if you ask a big corporation for various aspects, how many managers do you have? How many people are doing this? How many are doing that? What are their wages? What are their compensations? What are their health benefits? You generally don't get an answer to that. And even more importantly, what they do is send you things that are analogous to organizational charts, which are idealized versions of what the company is. It doesn't tell you who is communicating with whom and so forth. So this is a problem where data has clearly been manipulated in some form or another. And in order to develop, say, if you want to do a science of companies, a science of organizations, that data is crucial. One would like to know, for example, all the email between all the employees. One would like to know all the telephone calls, who's talking to whom, what is the social network within the company. So these are things that even if you get them, they've clearly been manipulated. And frankly, I don't see any way really to get around that, because the organizations like that are under no obligation, of course, to supply scientists or others that are interested in it, even politicians, with the raw data. So this is a big issue, particularly in the social sciences. I would say in the physical sciences, it's less of an issue. It becomes an issue and has become an issue in some of the biological, biomedical, and pharmaceutical sciences, because the inevitable role of money and of payoff and who got there first. And there you do see, and we have seen, examples of manipulation of data. And again, it's not a clear-cut case as to how you sort that out and how you apply controls and policing of such activities. And associated with that is the attempts of federal agencies across the globe to, when they support research, to insist that researchers make their data available, that there's transparency. So, and many researchers simply ignore that. That's a huge issue, and when they're pushed on it, they supply data that is sometimes not credible. So these are big issues. I don't know how we actually solve them, and I think, again, we run into some of the very problems that are behind the Wikipedia problem, and that is we operate now primarily through the web. We have time constraints, we have access constraints, and so on. So I'm actually quite concerned about the long-term access to both the raw data that a researcher or a company or a politician could have access to, but I'm equally concerned about data that traditionally has been manipulated, but manipulated there not in a negative connotation, but positive connotation, presenting with data that you can actually use in a useful way. But now I think we're getting data that has been manipulated in order to literally manipulate whoever looks at it, both in terms of their research, in terms of their proprietorship, in terms of their priority, and so forth, and their claims to originality. So I think I have no simple solution to this, and I'm not sure there is one, but I think this is a huge problem that's only going to get worse. So I'm sorry, I have no other comments to make.
It's all right. Thank you, Professor. And the discussion will be continued on this second topic, second question by Dr. Oleg Maltsev. Please, Dr. Oleg Maltsev, unmute yourself, мы вас не слышим. Теперь да.
Сейчас слышите, все в порядке?
Да.
Порядок? Окей. Спасибо, что дали слово.
Thank you so much for giving me the floor.
Вы знаете, я когда слушаю коллег, мне как бы всегда очень приятно понимать, насколько политизирована на сегодняшний день наука.
So, by these moments, having listened to the colleagues, actually Dr. Maltsev says he's pleased to know, he's pleased to be acquainted with the fact how much, let me say, science is being politicized today. I mean, how much politics right now is in science, in scientific field.
Ну, так как я человек аполитичный и нетолерантный, то я попытаюсь ответить на вопрос так, как оно есть на самом деле сегодня.
And since Dr. Maltsev is not acquainted with politics and he's claiming he's not that tolerant person, that's the reason he's going to be objective in his response.
Хочу напомнить коллегам о том, что понятие толерантности и понятие нейтральной точки зрения, они политические, они научные.
Let me please kindly remind you, dear colleagues, that such notions as being tolerant or being neutral, these are the notions coming from the politics. These are political fields notions, but not scientific ones.
То есть наука оперирует совершенно другими категориями.
The notions that scholars and representative of science operate are distinctively different.
И вот это нужно совершенно четко понимать.
And again, this is a very distinctive issue to claim and to know, to realize.
То есть Америка давно заболела такой тенденцией, что есть вроде как науки, а есть околонаучные направления.
You know, there is such a tendency in the area of America, I mean, in USA and the other countries, like it's even like a disease. Some people are just sick of knowing there are scientific branches of research and non-scientific, but close to scientific ones.
То есть американцы почему-то считают, что, я не знаю, кто им это, как бы объяснил, что точные науки – это науки.
So there is such a strong persuasion or even a stereotype amidst Americans that, you know, there are like natural sciences, like physics, mathematics, and these are scientific disciplines.
А гуманитарные науки – это околонаучные направления.
And there is a second part of this persuasion or stereotype that humanitarian disciplines or social humanitarian, these are, let me say, close to scientific disciplines, but not scientific ones.
И когда я начинал работать с американскими учеными, я был очень удивлен это услышав.
And having heard these two stereotypes concerning humanities, actually, Dr. Maltsev was very shocked.
Да. Потому что я им пытался объяснить, что это просто разные науки.
And the main idea that Dr. Maltsev tried to explain that, you know, there are just different scientific disciplines. There are different branches of science.
Но такие идеи в американской науке по сей день существуют.
However, there are still such ideas prevailing among even American scholars concerning this distinction between humanities and the other scientific branches.
И даже простой эксперимент, который я им показывал, их никак не вразумлял.
And even such a simple experiment we were speaking beforehand didn't help people to realize what's going on, what's scientific and what is not scientific.
То есть, что если бы не было гуманитарных наук, точным наукам нечего было бы считать.
Because right in case, well, if there were no humanities, then the natural hard sciences, they would never exist, and they wouldn't have substance to calculate, to deal with, to analyze and to substantiate.
Потому что прежде чем появляется, предположим, атомная бомба,
let's pretend before there is such a finding or such discovery or such a thing as atomic bomb,
то сначала появляется идея.
The idea comes first, and the atomic bomb comes next. The idea is the first issue.
Потом множество промежуточных этапов.
of course, between the idea and the atomic bomb as a thing, there are many preliminary stages.
И только потом идет в ход расчеты, эксперименты и так далее и тому подобное.
Still, the idea is that there are things that prevails everything, because ideas first, calculations, experiments, discussions, these are things that are coming next.
То есть все эти вещи в прикладном аспекте друг без друга существовать не могут.
Judging from the applied science perspective, all these things just cannot exist without one another. They are inherent in their coexistence.
То есть любая научная категория проходит прежде всего философскую категорию, а потом становится отраслевой категорией.
Every scientific notion actually passes through several stages. The first stage is the philosophical one. Having passed this philosophical stage, only then afterwards the scientific notion retransforms into something else, like into a product, into a discovery, etc.
В Советском Союзе был очень знаменитый человек, в том числе и в Соединенных Штатах Америки, академик Козырев.
There was such a well-known, remarkable scientific figure. He is actually, this is the ex-USSR scholar. However, people in America also were aware of him. This is academician Kozyrev.
И этот человек награжден 2 американскими государственными наградами.
And academician Kozyrev actually was awarded, he was even awarded with 2 American rewards.
Да. Он астрофизик.
He's astrophysician. Academician Kozyrev was astrophysician.
И когда он написал свою работу о нелинейной механике,
And academic Kozyrev is the author of Non-Linear Mechanics scientific piece.
научное сообщество его не приняло, эту работу.
And this non-linear mechanics actually was not the paper that scientific audience was eager to share his perspective with. They didn't, let me say, it wasn't perceived.
И это единственная работа его за всю жизнь, которую не приняло академическое сообщество.
And as a matter of fact, we should say that academician Kozyrev is the author of many, many works, and they were all let me say, allowed, okay? But still, only one work wasn't perceived. Only one work was banned. The others were not.
И это никак не умаляет достоинств Козырева как ученого.
However, one work banned out of a row of brilliant works. This is not the thing that that pushes us to claim that Kozyrev is a bad scientist. No, it's not like that.
Да. Что же произошло?
What has actually happened?
То есть научное сообщество сказало Козыреву о том, что он поспешил с этой работой.
Actually, the main idea of representative of scholars was that Mr. Kozyrev was actually, he was in great haste.
То есть ему сначала необходимо было сформулировать философскую теорию времени, а потом уже категорийную теорию времени.
Academician Kozyrev should have taken different tactics. However, he didn't do that. The right tactics would be as follows. The first thing academician Kozyrev should do, he actually could have done it, but he didn't. He should have written the scientific piece describing this philosophical category of non-linear mechanics.
Да, не линейной механики, а времени.
Not the non-linear mechanics, but the philosophical category of time.
И это работа его о нелинейной механике, работа астрофизика.
Again, Professor Kozyrev is an astrophysician who actually made a piece of paper dedicated to non-linear mechanics and time.
Так и осталось категорией философской, категорией времени.
However, this is a piece of work that represents the philosophical perspective of time. And still, even today, this is the work that is philosophical in its way.
И не стало категорией времени астрофизики.
However, again, this is just an issue of time from the philosophical perspective. But this philosophical perspective didn't retransform into the notion of astrophysics or the notion of physics and so on. It's still just on the level of philosophy, but it didn't retransform into anything else.
И когда люди спорят о том, какие показатели важнее, качественные или количественные,
and every time people argue upon what's better, what's more what's more significant, either the qualitative things or the others,
то хотелось бы им напомнить, что качественные показатели выполняют одну функцию, а количественные другую.
Again, the main idea is that calculative things are calculative and qualitative things, they share different functions in science.
Kачественные показатели позволяют делать научные открытия.
Qualitative measurements and characteristics push the scholar to the scientific discoveries.
А количественные проверять их достоверность.
The quantitative characteristics help the scholar to verify the significance and the credibility of that scientific discovery.
То есть одно без другого существовать не может.
However, qualitative and quantitative characteristics cannot live separately. They live in coexistence.
Если кто-то использует только количественные показатели, он не занимается научной работой.
And this is the thing that even helps us to say and to conclude that if the person deals only with qualitative characteristics, we cannot say this is a totally scientific work. This is a non-scientific approach.
То же самое касается качественных показателей.
The same is about the other extremity. Again, this is like two extremities. It's in the first extremity if we are only using qualitative characteristics. This is non-scientific approach. The second extremity about only quantitative characteristics.
То есть у каждой из этих вещей в науке свои задачи.
Again, each characteristic set shares its function in science.
Да. Далее. Есть такое понятие, как политическая и прочие установки в науке.
There are such notions as political judgments and the other judgments or the other perspectives in science.
То есть это те вещи, которые искажают науку.
Actually, these are the things that distort the scientific judgments at all.
То есть и эти вещи всегда присутствуют во всех странах мира в любое время.
And by these things, actually, that bear distortion, we mean tenets. And tenets, either political or non-political, they always existed and they still exist today.
То есть, когда мы видим некую академическую науку определенного времени, нам нужно понимать, что на нее действуют определенного рода установки со всех сторон.
So if we research certain scientific issue of certain historical period of time, we should realize that this is the product being constructed and being born, having passed certain tenets.
И то, что мы видим, это искаженная этими установками субстанция на настоящий момент времени.
And the scientific thing or scientific product we see today, we should realize this is the product of certain distortion produced by these tenets.
И последнее, что я хотел бы напомнить коллегам, о том, что репутация не является источником научной информации.
And the second issue to be emphatic about, let me say that reputation is still not the lever and not the authority lever for the scientific information.
Спасибо за внимание.
Thank you so much for your kind attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Maltsev. And the discussion will be continued by Professor Finckenauer. Professor Finckenauer, please unmute yourself.
Okay, thank you very much. Very interesting. I'm thinking as I'm listening to all of this discussion back and forth, and an odd thought popped into my mind. There's a very famous American author by the name of Mark Twain. And Mark Twain is alleged to have said once, there are lies, there are damn lies, and then there are statistics. And I'm thinking about, to go back to our earlier discussion about the Wikipedia, that Wikipedia is only one of those elements in sort of in common usage as a source of information. And probably when I think about some of those other sources, Wikipedia is of less concern to me than some of the social media sites that are promulgating particular points of view and arguing to the people who already believe in those points of view with presenting what purports to be data and information about some phenomenon. There is in psychology the notion of what's called confirmation bias. And what that means in essence is that once we have formed an opinion about something, we tend to want to hold on to that opinion. So when presented with a variety of information, we sort through that information to find that which already supports the opinion which supports the opinion we already have. And that tends to keep confirming that view. And that's what happens with some of these sites that are confirming views that the people who access those sites already have. So moving from that then to the more allegedly scientific process, as I said in my paper, there are lots of issues about the peer review process in science, which is supposed to be a corrective for inaccuracies and errors and so on in the material that's presented. But having been a peer reviewer for many years in many different settings, a variety of stuff, I can tell you that that process is extremely difficult. And it's very difficult to ensure to the nth degree that what someone is looking at is totally truthful and totally valid and reliable. The other thought that came to my mind in conjunction with that, many years ago, I remember having a graduate student, and this is the number of years ago, you'll be recognized because this was a time before personal computers. So in order to do statistical analysis, one had to take punch cards to a computer center, and they would run the punch cards, and you would get these printouts and so on. And this particular student would go to the computer center and punch data onto punch cards and then run these cards. He would come to my office with a giant stack of printouts, because whenever it came to the statistics, she would put run all the statistics. And then what she would do is sort through and throw away those statistical analyses that didn't support the finding that she wanted. And she would only pick out that which tended to support her hypotheses. Lest one think that that doesn't happen anymore, I would suggest you're wrong, because what happens is data analysis can be very sort of structured and couched in certain ways to produce the outcomes that one is looking for. Now, there's basically two kinds of error that enter into this process. One are just honest mistakes. People add up numbers wrong, or something got dropped out, or they lost some piece of the information or something. And it's an honest error. And oftentimes, well, maybe sometimes in the peer review process that can get corrected, but that can only happen if the peer reviewer has access to all the raw data. If you don't see all the raw data, you have no reason to disbelieve the data that the author is presenting for review. The more insidious problem is misconduct in research. This is where you have intentional efforts to distort the research outcomes for a whole variety of reasons. And this can happen because, first of all, you want to get your material published. Scientific journals have a negative attitude toward research which produces negative findings. They want to see hypotheses that get supported because they believe that those tend to move the field forward. So if you get negative findings, those tend not to get reported. The other thing that happens is people some researchers have a proprietary interest in the outcomes. So they want to see certain kinds of outcomes because they support where it is that they want to go. And I mentioned too in my paper, the people who did the research that were employed by cigarette manufacturing companies to study the effects of cigarette smoking on human health. Is clearly an example of having a proprietary interest in the results. There's concern, I'm not sure about elsewhere in the world, but there's a great deal of concern now in the United States about the development of these vaccines that are going to deal with the COVID-19 problem, and whether you can trust, given the way the research is going and given the amount of money that's been involved and how fast the research has been done, can one trust these results? None of this stuff has been published. There's been no peer review outside the actual production of the vaccines by any scientist to take a look at any of this. So there's a lot of concern about that. There are more issues. I speak as a social scientist. It's more difficult to become very clear and very precise in the social science area than it is in the natural science area. And that's because a lot of things are open to subjective judgment. And an example that I used, for example, social scientists will do some research using a form called observation. And as I said in my paper, observation is just what it sounds like. You look at things and then you make recordings from looking at those things. But in order to do an analysis, you got to somehow quantify this. You got to do this in some mode where you can actually have some kind of quantitative analysis. First of all, what you record, what you look at, what you decide is important, what you record is a subjective judgment. How you score it is a subjective judgment. Someone else looking at the very same thing and using the same method could come to a very different conclusion. How does the peer reviewer looking at this process therefore judge which of these is better, which one is more accurate, which one is less accurate? You don't really know. You look through this process and you try to make sense of this and try to find out how this is, what's going on here. You also have issues, I mean, just outright fakery. And again, the example I reported, people are hired to go out and conduct interviews. Knocking on doors and going out to individuals is a very time-consuming and a difficult process. It's much more comfortable to sit in the front seat of your car and fill out all the survey instruments yourself. And then you turn those in. The people looking at the results of that don't know that that's how that data got produced. They don't know that that's where those findings come from. They have to trust somehow in this process that what you're saying is the truth, but they really have no way of verifying that. And the last two things, there are lots of issues about ethics involved in the reporting of research. And I don't think we put enough stress on the education of scientists, I know we don't in the social scientists, about ethics and about mentoring young researchers about the importance of sticking to the truth, of producing valid and reliable findings. There's also a problem, I think, in what we reward. Lots of young researchers get into this game called publish or perish, meaning that you get a job and immediately you got to be churning out research articles and getting publication in highly regarded journals. Otherwise, your employment is not going to get retained. You're not going to get tenure in a university, or you're not going to be continued to be employed by a research institute because you're not publishing research. One of the downsides of that is puts pressure on young researchers to do a lot quickly and to produce the kind of findings that are going to get published. That is not necessarily a good thing to maintain the validity and integrity of science. And again, peer researchers, peer reviewers looking at submissions that would come into journal articles have no way of knowing that. And the last thing, and somebody already mentioned this, a lot that we depend upon is the reputation of the researchers. That this researcher is a well-known senior professor in their field, they've done all this work, they're good, therefore we can rely on this. Well, maybe you can, and maybe you can't. And I pointed out in my paper the retractions of papers that occurred from a reputable researcher who had cut corners and created non-existent samples and so on to produce certain kinds of findings. And I don't think that's unique to social science, and I don't think it's unique to my area of criminology. I think it's a general problem in science. And the last thing I'll say, I read something recently about a study that was done trying to replicate studies that had been published in well-known journals. And in a large majority of those cases, the new researchers could not replicate those findings. And therefore, it at least throws into question whether those original findings were reliable and valid in the first place. With that, I'll stop. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Finckenauer. It's a very interesting panel, and it should be justly noted that every speaker is so courageous because these topics were not discussed before like this publicly. Not every academic would be ready to discuss these things because they are very important and very complex. And the discussion will be continued by Anatoliy Lutsyuk.
Я немножко хотел продолжить, опять же, в контексте Википедии. Несколько дней назад в газете Independent вышла статья «Коронавирус scientists had to turn to date from Wikipedia at start pandemic documentary film». В принципе, авторы статьи и авторы фильма, который выходил на BBC, говорят, что была проблема в том, что приходилось брать данные с Википедии исследователям, которые прогнозировали течение пандемии.
First of all, I would like to continue about Wikipedia. First of all, I would like to share that in the newspaper Independent was published a certain article about pandemic. And what we see in this article, that actually all researchers, maybe it were journalistic researchers in this article, they took all the information from Wikipedia to analyze what is going on with pandemic.
Нет, здесь шла речь не о журналистском исследовании, это была передача, это статья о группе, которая консультировала правительство Соединенного Королевства по поводу принятия решения именно о том, как вступить в эту пандемию.
So Anatoliy Lutsyuk is coming back to the previous topic about the Wikipedia. He would like to provide a certain example. Recently in the Independent, there was an article which was about how scientists had to turn to Wikipedia for some information. And the case was that during the pandemic, a certain group of specialists in the United Kingdom, in order to take a decision regarding the pandemic, they had to turn to Wikipedia.
И получается, проблема в том, что действительно в начале пандемии не было достаточных данных, которые можно было получить с надежного источника, которые бы обобщали данные по пандемии именно со многих стран. И исследователи брали ее с Википедии. Но, возможно, как бы утверждается о том, что ошибки пошли именно за то, что были ошибки в Википедии. Но я полагаю, что здесь все-таки проблема не в этом.
The case is about that at the start of the pandemic, there was no generalized data from many countries, and all generalized data were in Wikipedia. That's why these people start to take information from the Wikipedia, and that's why they had certain mistakes.
Проблема все-таки в том, что, как оказалось, в этой группе не было вирусологов. Это были математики, которые занимались прогнозированием, и проблема в выборе моделей. Проблема выбора моделей, исходных данных для моделей. И, в принципе, вот это мы уже перешли на проблему манипулирования данными. То есть либо они хотели услышать, увидеть то, что они видели, либо недостаточно квалифицированно подошли. Как считается, и почему ошибки некоторых прогнозов, в частности по смертности, допустим, в Соединенных Штатах и в Британии, с реальностью разошлись в 10 раз. Это тоже как бы проблема либо проблема чего? Проблема манипулирования данными, или проблема недостоверности данных, или проблема неграмотной обработки данных.
So when we say about this issue, the problem is that there were no virologists. It were people that actually were mathematics. And they had the problem of choosing a model and initial data for this analysis. And actually here we come to the manipulation of data, maybe. We see that they had some mistakes when they tried to make a prognosis of people who died because of the pandemic, and this prognosis and the reality were totally different. And we see now that there is a problem, but what is the problem? The problem of manipulation of data, the problem of unreliability of the data, or maybe this is a problem of very not qualified of analysis.
И, скажем, эта пандемия показала множество проблем, которые есть, ну или некоторые, которые есть в современном обществе, не так в науке, как в обществе. Коммуникации между наукой и обществом практически отсутствует. То есть коммуникации, которые были через журналистику, через государственные учреждения, они, как оказалось, работают очень плохо, а сами ученые имеют меньше возможностей именно влиять на общественное мнение и достукиваться, скажем, до общественного мнения.
And also, this pandemic actually showed us many problems, not so in science, but in society. There is almost no communication between science and between society. We don't see it. We see that communication was due to journalistic data and some state institution, and it was not so good. And scientists actually don't have the opportunity to go strictly to society. They have to have somebody who will connect them.
И при этом, скажем, в результате получилось, что те вирусологи, те врачи, те инфекционисты, которые еще в январе, когда только в Китае начиналась эта пандемия, они не были услышаны. Были услышаны математики, были услышаны политики, были услышаны это. И получилось серьезное искажение, то есть как бы, которое в принципе можно пояснить либо ошибками, либо частично и манипулированием данными. То есть это как бы урок, эта пандемия дала такой урок, который, в принципе, я не знаю, сможет ли это общество достаточно правильно сделать выводы. Наше общество вот в целом.
And when we talk about doctors, virologists who actually back in January already said that we have a pandemic, please pay attention to this, but society doesn't believe it, and only mathematics and politics could speak about pandemic, and after society starts to believe this. And we see a distortion that can be explained by mistakes or even manipulation of data. And this pandemic taught us a certain lesson, and I'm not sure that society is ready to make some conclusions because of this lesson.
И многие ученые говорят, что этот год отбросил науку на 50 лет назад, потому что многие вопросы решают политики, журналисты, бизнесмены, вместо занимаются тем, чем должны заниматься были ученые. Это...
And many scientists say right now that this year actually showed us that the science moved back to 50 years ago, and many issues are decided right now by journalists, by politics, by some businessmen and other people that that's not involved in science itself.
Спасибо.
Thank you very much for your attention.
All right, thank you, Lutsyuk. And our panel is about to end right now. And Professor Finckenauer, if somebody wants to make a comment, you are happy to do so. If not, I'll be concluding this panel. It was a sheer pleasure to be moderating this online panel, and we are about to end it. I would like to thank every speaker and every participant of this online panel, and our colleagues that have left there very sorry that they had to. And in the course of several weeks, scientific and organizing committee would be preparing the resolution and collected papers books, and every speaker is going to be notified accordingly. So on the behalf of organizing committee, thank you very much once again. Bye.